The moment that ended my silence happened on a Tuesday morning in February, inside the fourth-floor waiting room of Piedmont Hospital in Atlanta. My father had been in surgery for 6 hours by then, a double bypass. The kind of surgery that changes families permanently, regardless of how it ends. I had been sitting in the same hard plastic chair since 3 in the morning, wearing the same clothes I pulled on when the hospital called, unwashed hair tied back with a rubber band I found inside my coat pocket, a half-empty coffee cup going cold between my palms. I hadn't eaten since the previous afternoon. My eyes felt raw and swollen. My stomach had turned itself into something resembling concrete somewhere around 5 a.m. and hadn't relaxed since. Derek arrived around 9. Freshly showered, pressed slacks, a quarter-zip pullover, looking like a man stopping through on his way to a morning meeting rather than a husband arriving to support a wife whose father might not survive the day. He kissed my temple once, squeezed my shoulder briefly, then settled into a chair across the waiting room and began reading something on his phone with the focused energy of a man whose attention had already moved elsewhere. His mother arrived 20 minutes later. Margaret Ashworth moved through spaces the way wealthy women of a certain generation tend to move through them, with the calm, unhurried certainty of someone who has never once questioned whether she belongs somewhere. She wore a cashmere coat in pale gray, silver hair cut short and precise, a leather handbag that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payment in Buckhead. She crossed the waiting room and hugged Derek first, the long embrace of a mother who had never fully accepted that her son belonged to anyone else. Then she turned toward me with the particular smile she had spent years perfecting, the kind that looked warm from across the room but felt like cold metal up close. "How are you holding up, Sarah?" she asked. "Fine," I said, tired. Margaret settled beside Derek on the waiting room chairs, adjusted her coat, lowered her voice as though speaking privately between the two of them, and then said the sentence that I still hear clearly in my head every single time I need to remember why I finally stopped being afraid. "Derek," she said, not quietly enough, "you really should have someone look at those company finances before this situation becomes messy." I looked up immediately. She wasn't speaking to me. She was speaking past me, around me, the way certain people speak past furniture they've already decided doesn't matter. My father was somewhere above us on a surgical table with his chest open and his heart exposed, and Margaret Ashworth was discussing my family's business with my husband as though I were a houseplant placed inconveniently beside the window. Derek glanced at me once and said absolutely nothing. Margaret continued. "James built that company long before certain complications entered the picture." She paused with practiced delicacy. "Sarah may not fully understand what she's dealing with on the financial side of things. These situations require real expertise, people who know how these transitions work." I set my coffee cup down very slowly on the side table beside me. Margaret finally looked in my direction. "I'm sure you've done your best managing things, dear, but there are people better equipped for this kind of complexity." I said nothing. I sat completely still and said nothing, and Margaret returned to speaking with Derek about a dinner party she was planning for the following weekend, as though the previous 30 seconds had not happened. That was the 4th of February, 2023. I remember the exact date because grief burns timestamps into your memory whether you consent to it or not. I did not respond to Margaret in that waiting room, not because the words weren't there. They were, clearly, completely. I said nothing because my father was on a surgical table 6 floors above my head, and I did not have the capacity to begin the conversation that morning that would eventually need to happen. But I stored every word she said, carefully, in the particular part of the mind that never forgets being dismissed by someone who should have known better. My father, James Mensah, built Mensah Industrial Supply from a single-use delivery van and a rented storage unit on Memorial Drive in Decatur, Georgia, starting in the spring of 1987. He was 27 years old. He had $4,000 in personal savings, a mechanical engineering degree from Georgia Tech, 6 years of hands-on experience working for a commercial HVAC company in Marietta, and an accent that caused certain clients to hang up the phone before he finished his opening sentence. He grew up in Kumasi, Ghana, arrived in the United States on a student visa in 1981, and spent most of his 20s working harder than anyone around him, while quietly absorbing everything those people refused to teach him directly. He decided to start the company after watching his supervisor at the HVAC firm lose a major hotel construction contract simply because of poor inventory management and inconsistent delivery timelines. My father recognized the gap immediately. He understood the supply chain side of commercial plumbing and HVAC work better than anyone he had encountered. He saw the opportunity clearly. He took it. By the time I was born in 1985, the business had 3 vans, a small warehouse, and 2 steady contractor accounts. By the time I started middle school, Mensah Industrial Supply had long-term supply contracts with some of the largest hotel construction groups operating across Georgia. By the time I graduated from Georgia State University in 2007 with a degree in business administration, the company was one of the most reliable commercial plumbing and HVAC distributors in the southeastern United States, serving contractors from Atlanta to Charlotte to Jacksonville, with annual revenue sitting just above $12 million and a staff of 41 people who genuinely liked working there. My father never talked about his success in social settings. That was partly cultural, the Ghanaian instinct toward quiet dignity over public performance, and partly just the particular kind of man he was. He drove a 10-year-old Camry for 15 years because he said reliable men drove reliable cars. He celebrated his employees' birthdays personally. He knew the names of their children and their spouses. He remembered who was dealing with a sick parent or a difficult mortgage or a struggling marriage, and he found quiet ways to help without making people feel small for needing it. He kept his books immaculate and his promises cleaner than that. Growing up inside that kind of work ethic shapes a person differently than most people realize. I spent my summers in the warehouse from the age of 14, labeling inventory boxes and answering phones during lunch breaks. By the time I was in college, I was reviewing supplier contracts with my father on evenings and weekends. After graduation, I joined the company officially as operations coordinator, which was a formal title for a role that really meant learning every function of the business from the ground up and handling whatever needed handling on any given day. Purchasing, logistics, customer relations, payroll questions, supplier negotiations, staff situations my father found emotionally exhausting. I absorbed all of it because I genuinely loved the company the way you love something you watched being built, one careful decision at a time. I met Derek Ashworth at a charity fundraiser in Buckhead in April of 2013. He was charming in the particular way that men from old Atlanta money learn to be charming before they're old enough to understand why it works. Easy confidence, relaxed posture, the kind of unhurried laugh that fills a room naturally. His grandfather had started an insurance company in the 1940s. His father, Robert Ashworth Sr., had developed a significant portion of the residential real estate across Atlanta's northern suburbs during the 1990s. His mother, Margaret, chaired philanthropic boards, attended every important social event in the city, and conducted her personal relationships with the efficiency and subtle ruthlessness of a corporate executive who never needed to raise her voice. Derek pursued me with what felt at the time like genuine patience and sincerity. We dated for 2 years before he proposed. My father had dinner with us several times during that period and was polite and generous throughout, though I remember watching him observe Derek one evening at the kitchen table with a particular quality of stillness I recognized. My father only went very quiet around people he was studying carefully. The Ashworth family accepted my presence in their lives the way an expensive house accepts an imperfect repair, visible only to those who knew exactly where to look. Margaret established this arrangement from the very beginning without ever once saying anything that could be directly challenged. She simply relied on the accumulated weight of small, precise dismissals delivered with perfect politeness. She asked questions that functioned as quiet verdicts. "Does your family business have a real succession structure in place, Sarah?" Not said with cruelty. Said with the patient concern of someone already convinced of the answer. She once described Mensah Industrial Supply to a friend at a dinner party as the little distribution outfit Sarah's father runs in Decatur, smiling warmly while she said it. She referred to my work at the company as Sarah helping out with things at the family shop. Not managing operations. Not running supply logistics across 5 states. Helping out with things. Like I was occasionally restocking shelves as a personal favor. Derek absorbed this framing the way children absorb the beliefs of their parents. Slowly at first, then so completely it became invisible. In the first years of our marriage, he was generally supportive, or at least present enough to perform support convincingly. But as his own real estate development work expanded and his social circle moved further into Atlanta's upper tier of professional society, something shifted in the way he positioned me in conversation. He began introducing me at events as my wife, Sarah, she's involved with her father's business, delivered with the particular inflection of a man being generously vague about something he found mildly embarrassing. I noticed every adjusted sentence, every redirected conversation, every moment he deferred to his mother's evaluation of my life over my own. I stayed quiet through most of it because I believed that patience inside a marriage was more important than winning individual arguments. That particular belief cost me considerably more than I expected. My father's health had been sending warnings since the summer of 2022. Unexplained fatigue, shortness of breath climbing the same warehouse stairs he had climbed without effort for 30 years. His cardiologist found partial blockages in 2 coronary arteries during a stress test in October and recommended surgery without delay. My father, being my father, spent the following 3 months methodically reviewing every outstanding company contract, completing every financial obligation, and walking our operations manager Gerald through 16 separate backup procedures before he would agree to schedule the procedure. He was not afraid of the surgery. He simply refused to leave anything unfinished. He called me into his office 2 weeks before the operation date. It was a gray January morning, winter light pressing flat through the blinds behind his desk. He looked older to me that morning than he had ever looked before. Not diminished, not fragile. Just tired in the specific way that people look when they have been carrying something heavy for a very long time and have finally decided, carefully and deliberately, to set it down. He slid a thick envelope across the desk toward me without speaking first. "Already signed and filed," he said quietly. "Richard has the originals." Richard Boateng was my father's attorney, a meticulous, deeply private man who had handled my father's legal and business affairs since 1999. A man my father trusted more than almost anyone outside his immediate family. I opened the envelope carefully. Transfer documents, shareholder restructuring agreements, updated operating authority designations. I looked up slowly. "Dad." He folded his hands on the desk and looked at me steadily. "I want you to understand this business without my shadow in the room," he said. "You've understood it for years already. You just haven't had the full authority to prove that to anyone else." I pressed my fingertips against the edge of the documents, not yet fully absorbing what I was holding. He continued, "Whatever happens after the surgery, whatever anyone tells you, whatever conversations start happening around you without your permission, you call Richard first. Before you sign anything. Before you agree to anything, you call Richard." I nodded carefully. He looked at me for a long moment before speaking again. "You were always the one who understood what I actually built here." He paused, choosing his words. "Not the trucks and the warehouses. Not the revenue. The reason behind all of it. My father went into surgery on the 4th of February, 2023, at 7:14 inches the morning. He survived. But while he was on that table, the people sitting in the waiting room below him had already begun deciding what to do with his life's work. And not one of them had the basic decency to ask me a single question first. My father spent 11 days in the cardiac care unit before the doctors moved him to a standard recovery room. During that time, he slept more than he had probably slept in 30 years combined. His body was doing the slow, unglamorous work of healing, and there was nothing to do but wait and be present and try not to fall apart in the hallways. I drove to the hospital every morning and stayed until visiting hours ended. I brought his reading glasses because he forgot them at home. I spoke with his nurses about his medication schedule and his dietary restrictions and the specific way he liked his room temperature adjusted at night. I handled incoming calls from the company during the day, sitting in the hospital parking garage with my laptop open on the passenger seat, reviewing purchase orders and checking in with Gerald about warehouse operations, and reassuring our longest-standing clients that nothing at Mensah Industrial Supply was changing. Derek came to the hospital 4 times across those 11 days. I counted. Not obsessively. I simply noticed. The first visit lasted 40 minutes. The second was shorter. The third time he arrived, he spent most of it on a phone call in the corridor outside my father's room. The fourth visit, he brought Margaret, who stood at the foot of my father's bed speaking about her own physician in terms that suggested my father's cardiologist might benefit from a second opinion, while my father nodded patiently with the expression of a man who had learned long ago that certain conversations were simply weather to be waited out. After Margaret left the room to get coffee, my father looked at me from his hospital bed with the calm, clear gaze he used when he wanted me to understand something without him having to say it directly. I nodded once. He nodded back. That was the entire conversation, and it communicated everything that needed communicating. 2 weeks after my father came home from the hospital, Derek sat down across from me at our kitchen table on a Sunday evening and said he wanted to talk about the business. I set down my coffee cup. Okay. He clasped his hands on the table, the way he did when he had rehearsed something. Mom thinks, and honestly I agree, that this might be the right time to consider bringing in professional management for Mensah Industrial, outside leadership, someone with a larger operational background. I looked at him carefully. The company has been professionally managed since 1987. Derek exhaled slightly. Sarah, your father just had open heart surgery. He's going to need to step back permanently. And you've been running day-to-day operations under him your whole career. This is a different situation. The company needs real executive leadership now. I am the executive leadership now, I said quietly. Something shifted in his expression. Not anger exactly. More like the mild frustration of someone discovering a process taking longer than expected. He leaned forward slightly. I'm talking about someone with a track record of growing companies at this scale. Someone investors and potential partners would take seriously. I want you to understand exactly how that sentence landed. Not because Derek raised his voice. He didn't. He said it the way you might explain to a child why their drawing isn't quite ready to hang in a gallery. Gently, patiently. With the embedded assumption that the child already knows, somewhere beneath their optimism, that the adults are right. Someone potential partners would take seriously. 7 years of marriage. 7 years of watching me manage supplier relationships worth millions of dollars. 7 years of sitting across dinner tables while I discussed logistics contracts and regional distribution agreements and workforce management challenges with the people who actually ran the company. 7 years, and Derek Ashworth still looked at me and saw someone who needed replacing with a real professional. I said nothing for a long moment. Then I told him I would think about it. That was the right answer strategically. Not because I intended to agree, but because I needed time to understand how far this had already progressed without my knowledge. It had progressed further than I expected. Over the following 2 weeks, I began paying closer attention to things I had previously dismissed as background noise. Derek's phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered rooms. His sudden interest in the specifics of Mensah Industrial supplier contracts, asking questions during dinner that had no reason to come from genuine curiosity. His late evening meetings described vaguely as real estate investor conversations that appeared on no calendar I could access. Then Meredith called me. Meredith Osei was one of my closest friends, had been since college, and also happened to work in commercial real estate finance at a firm in Midtown Atlanta. She called me on a Wednesday afternoon in late February, and I could tell from the first 2 seconds of her voice that she hadn't called to chat. Sarah, she said carefully, I need to tell you something and I need you to stay calm while I do it. I was standing in the Mensah Industrial Warehouse in Decatur at the time, reviewing an inventory discrepancy with Gerald, and I stepped outside into the cold parking lot immediately. Okay, tell me. There was a brief pause. I had a referral meeting last week with a development group looking at acquiring a mid-size commercial supply distributor in the Southeast. They were specifically describing a company matching Mensah Industrial's profile. Revenue range, geographic footprint, client mix, everything. She paused again. Sarah, Derek was at that meeting. I stood very still in the parking lot. The February wind was sharp and cold across the asphalt, and I barely felt it. Derek was there as a consultant, she continued. He was helping them structure the acquisition approach. The group is called Dalton Capital Partners. They've been building a portfolio of regional distributors for consolidation. How long has this been going on? I asked. She hesitated. From what I could piece together from the conversation, at least 6 weeks. 6 weeks. Which meant Derek had been building this quietly before my father even had the surgery. While my father was scheduling his operation, completing his obligations, and reviewing company procedures with his staff, his son-in-law was sitting across conference room tables in Midtown Atlanta, helping strangers structure a plan to acquire the company. I thanked Meredith and stood in that parking lot for 3 full minutes without moving. The cold eventually pulled me back inside. I didn't confront Derek that night. I've thought about that decision many times since then, and I still believe it was the correct one. Confrontation would have forced him to become defensive, to accelerate whatever timeline he and Dalton Capital were working toward, to involve Margaret in a way that would complicate everything further. I needed information more than I needed the temporary relief of an argument. So I did what my father had quietly taught me to do when problems arrived, wearing the face of something manageable. I slowed down. I started paying attention to details, and I called Richard Boateng. Richard met me for coffee at a quiet place in Decatur that Friday morning. He was already seated when I arrived, a tall, composed man in his late 50s who wore the same style of dark suit every time I had ever seen him. With the unhurried presence of someone who had navigated other people's crises for so long, he had stopped being surprised by the shape they took. I told him everything. The hospital conversation, Derek's kitchen table proposal about professional management, Meredith's phone call, Dalton Capital Partners. Richard listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup slowly between his hands. Then he said something I had not expected. "Your father called me in November." I stared at him. November was 3 months before the surgery, 3 months before any of the hospital conversations or the kitchen table discussions. Richard continued. He had concerns he didn't want to discuss at the office. He asked me to review the company ownership structure and make certain amendments were completed and properly documented before February. He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a folder, set it on the table between us. I opened it carefully. The documents inside were dense with legal language, but the structure was clear enough. My father had transferred full controlling interest in Mensah Industrial Supply to me. Not a partial transfer, not a shared arrangement. A complete transfer of operational authority and majority ownership. Executed, witnessed, notarized, and filed with the Georgia Secretary of State's office in December of 2022. The company was mine. Entirely and legally mine. Had been since December. Richard watched me process this. "Your father was very specific about the timing," he said quietly. "He didn't want this discussed until it became necessary." "Why?" I asked. Richard folded his hands. He said that people behave honestly when they believe nothing has changed yet. He wanted to understand what certain people would do when they thought the opportunity was open before they discovered it wasn't. I sat back slowly in my chair. "He also said something else," Richard continued. "He said that you had spent your career building something real inside that company, and that you deserved to discover that for yourself without him standing beside you, making it easier." I looked down at the documents. Outside the coffee shop window, Decatur moved past at its ordinary morning pace. People walking dogs. A school bus turning at the corner. Ordinary Tuesday life continuing indifferently around the edges of a moment that was rearranging everything I thought I understood about the previous several months. "You need to be careful about what you say and to whom," Richard said. "And you need to say nothing to Derek about these documents until the right moment presents itself." I nodded slowly. He looked at me steadily over his coffee cup. "Your father didn't just change the paperwork, Sarah. He told me quite clearly that he was leaving the company in the right hands. I'd suggest you start trusting that assessment." I drove back to the warehouse after leaving Richard, parked in the same spot I always used, near the side loading bay where the older drivers liked to take their lunch breaks when the weather was tolerable. I sat inside the car for several minutes looking at the building my father started with $4,000 and a second-hand van in 1987. 41 employees, 5 southeastern states, $12 million in annual revenue. 36 years of kept promises and honored obligations and quietly extraordinary work done by a man who never once needed anyone else to tell him he was important. I thought about Margaret Ashworth sitting in that hospital waiting room. Real expertise. People better equipped for this kind of complexity. Sarah may not fully understand what she's dealing with. Then I thought about Derek. Someone potential partners would take seriously. I stayed very calm. Because beneath the steadiness, something had shifted permanently. The version of me that absorbed dismissal quietly and waited patiently for acknowledgement had stepped aside somewhere between that hospital parking garage and Richard Boateng's coffee table. What stepped in to replace her was considerably less patient. I picked up my phone and called Gerald. "Tell the afternoon crew I'll be in the warehouse until 6, I said. "I want to walk every section with you today." Gerald sounded mildly surprised. "Everything all right?" "Everything is fine," I told him. "I just want to make sure I understand every corner of this operation." He paused briefly. "Your father used to say exactly the same thing whenever he was preparing for something important." I smiled faintly. "Yes," I said. "I know." March arrived cold and wet across Atlanta that year, the kind of early spring that can't quite commit to warming up, gray skies pressing down over the city for days at a time while the trees stayed stubbornly bare. I spent most of that month in a state of controlled awareness that I had never experienced before in quite the same way. Alert to everything, quiet about most of it. At home, Derek and I maintained the surface of a normal marriage the way two people maintain the surface of a conversation when both of them know something important is being left unsaid. We ate dinner together most evenings. We talked about ordinary things, his development project in Sandy Springs, the weather, whether the kitchen needed repainting. I watched him carefully during these evenings, and he watched me in return, and neither of us acknowledged that we were watching each other. I said nothing about Meredith's phone call, nothing about Richard Boateng, nothing about the documents sitting in my father's attorney's office with my name on every controlling line. I had learned something about patience from my father that most people who met him assumed was simply his personality. It wasn't personality, it was discipline. My father understood that people who act before they fully understand a situation consistently lose to people who wait until they do. He had built 36 years of business success on that single principle, and I finally understood it completely for the first time in my life. At the company, I moved quietly and deliberately. I arrived before the warehouse opened each morning and stayed until the last driver finished his afternoon route report. I sat with Gerald for 2 hours every day reviewing operations metrics, supplier performance, delivery timelines, and client satisfaction records. I met individually with each of our department managers, purchasing, logistics, accounts. I asked questions and listened to the answers without interrupting, which turned out to be more unusual than it should have been. Meredith told me later that one of the warehouse supervisors, a man named Curtis who had worked for my father since 2004, mentioned to Gerald after my second walkthrough that the boss's daughter was either genuinely interested in the operation or the best actor he had ever encountered. Gerald apparently told him those two things were not mutually exclusive. On the 15th of March, Derek told me over dinner that he had arranged a meeting. He said it casually, the way he said things he had considered carefully but wanted to appear spontaneous. He poured himself a glass of water and looked across the table with the relaxed expression of someone delivering information rather than a decision. Some people I've been working with want to sit down and talk about the company's future, he said. I told them we'd do it at the house. Sunday afternoon. I set my fork down carefully. What people? He described them as investors with experience in logistics consolidation, men who understood regional distribution at scale. He used the phrase serious professionals twice in 4 sentences, which told me everything about what he thought the meeting was actually about. I said nothing immediately. Then I asked who else would be attending. Mom will be there, he said. And Robert possibly. He meant his father. And I've invited Michael Holt from Dalton Capital. There it was. Not even concealed anymore. Derek had moved past the stage of quiet maneuvering into the stage of open execution, and he was doing it with the confidence of a man who genuinely believed he had already won something. Fine, I said simply. Sunday works. He looked at me carefully for a moment, slightly surprised by the absence of resistance. Then he nodded, and the conversation moved on. I called Richard that night after Derek had gone upstairs. I told him about the Sunday meeting. Richard was quiet for a long moment before speaking. Don't say anything that confirms or denies the ownership transfer, he said. Let them talk. Let them show you exactly how far they've taken this. Then what? Then we'll know what we're dealing with, he said, and you'll know how to respond. Sunday came overcast and cool, the kind of afternoon that felt more like late November than mid-March. I made coffee and set out the good cups before anyone arrived, because my mother had raised me to receive guests properly regardless of their intentions, and because I wanted the atmosphere in the room to remain calm. Controlled environments favor patient people. Margaret arrived first, of course. Then Robert, Derek's father, a silver-haired man in his late 60s who was broadly pleasant in a distracted way, the kind of man who built his success on instinct decades ago and had since allowed his wife to handle the subtleties of everything important. He shook my hand warmly at the door and asked about my father's recovery, with what seemed like genuine concern, which I appreciated even then. Michael Holt arrived at 2 o'clock. He was younger than I expected. 40, perhaps 42, dressed in business casual with the particular ease of someone accustomed to being the most financially significant person in most rooms he entered. He had sharp eyes and a measured handshake, and he looked at me when Derek introduced us with the brief, assessing glance of someone trying to determine quickly how much of an obstacle I represented. We sat in the living room. I brought the coffee through on a tray and set it on the table, and then took the chair nearest the window and said very little while Michael Holt began speaking. He talked about Dalton Capital's acquisition portfolio, the operational efficiencies achieved through regional consolidation, the market advantages of combining complementary distribution networks. He used industry language fluently and presented numbers from comparable acquisitions with practiced ease, and through most of it, Derek nodded with the attentiveness of a man who had heard the presentation before and approved of it. Margaret contributed at precise intervals. She asked Michael questions that were actually statements dressed in question form. Questions about management transition timelines and leadership restructuring and the importance of bringing in experienced operational leadership during ownership changes. She never looked at me directly during these contributions. She looked at Michael or at Derek or at some neutral middle distance, and she spoke about my father's company as though its future were a matter entirely separate from my involvement in it. At one point, Robert said, mildly, that James had built a remarkable operation. Michael agreed pleasantly. Margaret mentioned that James's health situation made thoughtful transition planning particularly important right now. Derek nodded, and the conversation continued rolling forward with the smooth momentum of something that had been moving in one direction for long enough that nobody in the room expected it to stop. Nobody except me. I sat in my chair beside the window and drank my coffee and listened to every word. I watched Michael Holt's eyes when he spoke about acquisition pricing. I watched Derek's posture when Margaret talked about the need for new leadership. I watched Robert's hands, which stayed folded politely in his lap throughout the entire meeting because Robert Ashworth was a man who understood power but preferred not to visibly exercise it. At some point, Michael turned toward me directly for the first time in the meeting. He did it with the careful courtesy of a man performing due diligence on what he already assumed was a settled matter. Sarah, from your perspective, what do you see as the biggest operational challenge facing the company right now? The question landed in the room like a small test. Everyone's attention shifted toward me simultaneously. I looked at Michael Holt and answered him with complete seriousness for the next 4 minutes. I discussed our Q1 supplier contract renegotiations and the specific pricing pressures coming from 2 of our largest wholesale accounts. I talked about the logistics software upgrade we had been evaluating since November and the projected efficiency gains from the implementation. I mentioned the retention figures for our driving staff, which were significantly above the regional industry average, and explained the specific management practices behind that number. I referenced our 5-year client retention rate and the relationship-based sales approach my father had institutionalized over 3 decades that made those numbers possible. By the time I finished, Michael Holt was looking at me differently, not dramatically, just with the slight recalibration that happens when someone encounters more resistance to a classification than they expected. Margaret recovered first. She gave a small, gracious smile. Sarah has always been very involved at the operational level, she said, addressing Michael as though translating something. James included her early on. Involved at the operational level. 36 years of company history and nearly 15 years of my own direct contribution reduced to a single phrase that made it sound like I helped file paperwork on weekends. I looked at Margaret for a moment without speaking. Then I smiled quietly and reached for my coffee cup and said nothing further. The meeting ended 90 minutes later with Michael Holt talking about follow-up conversations and preliminary valuation timelines, and Derek walking him to the door with the easy confidence of a man who believed a transaction was already essentially complete. Margaret stayed for another 20 minutes after Michael left, speaking with Robert about a property they were considering in Alpharetta, while I collected the coffee cups from the living room and washed them in the kitchen sink. Derek came into the kitchen after his parents left. He leaned against the counter with his arms crossed and studied me with the careful expression he used when he was trying to assess something he couldn't quite read. "You were quiet in there," he said. I dried my hands on a dish towel. I was listening. He waited for something further. I didn't give him anything. He pushed himself off the counter. "I think this could be really good for us, Sarah. Good money. A clean exit. You could do something you actually enjoy. Something I actually enjoy, as though the company my father built and the work I had spent my career doing was a temporary inconvenience I had been enduring while waiting for permission to pursue a real life." I folded the dish towel carefully and set it on the counter. "I'll think about it," I said again, the same answer I had given 3 weeks earlier. Calm, clean, non-committal. Derek nodded, satisfied, and went upstairs. I stood in that kitchen for several minutes after he left, looking out the window over the backyard where pale winter grass was just beginning to show the first faint suggestion of green underneath. Then I picked up my phone and sent Richard Boateng a text. 4 words. I know what I'm doing. He responded in under 2 minutes. Good. I'll be ready. The following 6 weeks were the hardest working period of my professional life, and I say that as someone who grew up restocking warehouse shelves at 14 years old. I arrived at Mensah Industrial before sunrise every morning and structured my days around a single objective. I needed to understand every dimension of the company well enough to make decisions my father would have made, and I needed to do it fast enough that when the moment arrived, there would be no reasonable question about whether I was capable of running it. I renegotiated our primary pipe fitting supplier contract in early April, recovering a pricing margin that had been quietly eroding for 3 years. I completed a full operational audit with our CFO, a careful woman named Patricia who had been with the company for 11 years and who, I later discovered, had been deeply uncomfortable with the conversations Derek had been initiating around the office regarding acquisition readiness. Patricia told me during our 3rd meeting together that she had been waiting for someone to ask her the right questions. I asked her every question I had. By late April, the company's first quarter financials were stronger than the previous year's same period by a margin that surprised even Gerald. He brought the preliminary numbers to me on a Thursday morning with an expression that sat somewhere between impressed and quietly vindicated. Your father used to say the company was healthiest when someone who understood its soul was in charge of its body, Gerald said, setting the report on my desk. I looked at the numbers for a long moment. Go home on time tonight, Gerald, I told him. You've earned it. He smiled. So have you. Outside the office window, spring was finally fully arriving across Atlanta. Trees along Memorial Drive showed green for the first time since autumn. The warehouse lot was busy with morning deliveries and drivers starting their routes, and the ordinary productive noise of a business that had been running steadily for 36 years because one man understood something fundamental about what work was actually for. I thought about Derek and Michael Holt sitting in my living room 6 weeks earlier, discussing valuation timelines and leadership transitions while I washed the coffee cups they had used. I thought about Margaret, involved at the operational level. Then I opened my email, wrote a response to an inquiry we had received from a major hotel construction group expanding operations into Tennessee, and began building what would eventually become the largest single client contract in Mensah Industrial Supply's history. Nobody in the Ashworth family knew a thing about any of it. The Atlanta Business Council spring dinner happened every year on the 2nd Thursday of May at the Grand Hyatt in Buckhead. It was the kind of event that filled 3 ballrooms and required 6 months of table reservations, the kind where Atlanta's legal, financial, real estate, and commercial industries gathered in formal clothes to eat overpriced chicken and give each other awards while networking with the focused intensity of people who never fully stopped working regardless of what room they were standing in. My father had attended every year since 2001. He sat at the same table with the same 3 contractor partners he had built relationships with over 2 decades and spent most of the evening listening more than talking, which was how he operated everywhere. He had received the Business Legacy Award from the Council in 2018 and kept the plaque on the wall of his office between his engineering degree and a photograph of the original Memorial Drive warehouse. Not prominently displayed, just present. I had attended with him most years since 2009. Derek came occasionally when his social calendar permitted it, which translated to roughly half the time. Margaret considered the Business Council dinner slightly beneath her preferred social register but attended selectively when she felt the guest list warranted her presence. This year, the invitation arrived in my name specifically. The Council's executive director, a sharp, organized woman named Beverly Osei, no relation to Meredith, called me personally in early April. She told me the Council wanted to present Mensah Industrial Supply with the Regional Business Excellence Award at the May dinner, recognizing the company's 36-year contribution to Atlanta's commercial construction sector. She said my father's legacy in the community was extraordinary and that the Council felt the timing was appropriate given his recent health situation. She asked if I would accept the award on behalf of the company and say a few words. I told her I would be honored. Then she said something I wasn't expecting. She also mentioned that the keynote speaker this year was Calvin Merritt. I sat very still for a moment when she said that name. Calvin Merritt was 63 years old, a former commercial contractor who had built one of the largest construction management firms in the southeastern United States over a 40-year career before transitioning to private investment and mentorship. He was one of the most respected voices in Atlanta's commercial real estate and construction industry. He had also known my father since the early 1990s, back when my father was running 3 vans out of a rented storage unit, and Calvin was a mid-level project manager trying to find reliable HVAC suppliers for a hotel project in downtown Atlanta. They had been friends, quietly, in the way that men of that generation maintained friendships. Through occasional dinners and mutual professional respect, and the shared experience of building something real from nothing in a city that was not always generous about who it allowed to succeed. I thanked Beverly and told her I looked forward to the evening. I did not tell Derek about Calvin Merritt. I did tell him about the award because concealing it entirely would have required an explanation later that I didn't want to provide. I mentioned it at dinner casually, the way he delivered information he'd already decided about. The Business Council is giving the company a recognition award at the May dinner, I said. I'll be accepting it. Derek looked up from his phone. That's good. You should come, I said. He considered it briefly. Sure, Mom will want to come too. You know how she is about the Business Council crowd. I nodded. Of course. Margaret's enthusiasm when Derek mentioned it was immediate and revealing. She called me the following day to discuss table arrangements and what she described as making sure the right people understood the context of the evening. I was not entirely certain what context she meant, though I had a reasonable suspicion. Whatever narrative she had been building in Buckhead social circles about the company's future direction and the Ashworth family's role in it apparently required a public stage, and the Business Council dinner provided one conveniently. She asked twice whether Michael Holt had been invited. I told her I hadn't thought about it. She suggested it might be a good opportunity for introductions, to let the right people in the room see that the company had serious professional support around it going forward. Serious professional support. I wrote those words down after we hung up, in the small notebook I had been keeping since February, because I had developed a habit of recording the precise language people used when they thought they were speaking around me rather than to me. In the 3 weeks between that phone call and the dinner, I completed more work than I had managed in the previous 3 months combined. The Tennessee hotel contract was finalized on April 28th. A 47-month supply agreement with a construction group expanding across 4 southeastern states, representing the single largest client commitment in Mensah Industrial's history. Patricia ran the numbers twice before bringing them to me, because she didn't trust herself to have calculated correctly the first time. When the total contract value appeared on my desk, I sat with it quietly for a long moment before folding the papers and placing them in my briefcase. I called my father that evening. He was at home recovering, moving carefully through the slow process of rebuilding his stamina, reading more than he had allowed himself to in years. He answered on the second ring. I told him about the Tennessee contract. I told him the numbers. He was quiet for several seconds. Then he said softly, in Twi, the phrase he had used my entire childhood when something exceeded what he had hoped for. It translated roughly as, "This is what the work was always for." I had to put the phone down for a moment after that. The evening of May 9th was clear and warm, the kind of spring night Atlanta produces occasionally that feels like an apology for the gray weeks preceding it. I arrived at the Grand Hyatt at 6:30 in a deep navy dress I had bought specifically for the occasion, simple and professional, nothing performative about it. I checked in at the registration table, confirmed my place cards, and spent 20 minutes speaking with Beverly about the program timeline before the room began filling. Derek arrived with Margaret and Robert at 7. Margaret wore burgundy and diamonds and moved through the lobby greeting people with the practiced warmth of a woman in her natural habitat. She found me near the entrance and squeezed my arm briefly. "You look lovely, dear. Very appropriate." I thanked her. Derek kissed my cheek. "Good turnout tonight," he observed, scanning the room with the professional interest of a man cataloging useful connections. I nodded and said nothing further. Michael Holt arrived at 7:15. I watched from across the lobby as Margaret guided him smoothly toward our table, her hand briefly on his arm, leaning close to say something that made him nod and glance once in my direction, before following her inside. The evening was already fully assembled in her mind. I understood. The award was the backdrop. The real performance was the introduction of serious professional support to the room. I found my seat at the table and waited. Dinner moved through its standard sequence: salads and bread rolls and table conversations, and the particular low hum of 300 professionally successful people performing enjoyment while actually working. Derek talked with Robert about their Sandy Springs project. Margaret charmed Michael Holt with practiced ease, steering the conversation toward the company at regular intervals with the precision of someone who had been steering conversations professionally for 40 years. I spoke with the contractor across from me, a man named David Park, whose firm had been a Mensah Industrial client for 11 years. We talked about the Tennessee project and the expansion opportunity it represented for the regional market. He seemed genuinely excited. He had known my father for a long time. The award portion of the program began at 8:30. Beverly introduced 3 award recipients before Mensah Industrial. I sat through each one with my hands folded in my lap, watching the room settle into its post-dinner attentiveness. Then Beverly described the Regional Business Excellence Award. She spoke about 36 years of consistent service, about the company's role in Atlanta's commercial construction growth since the late 1980s, about employment, community investment, and what she called the quiet infrastructure of a region's economic health that most people benefited from without ever noticing. Margaret was smiling in the direction of Michael Holt across the table. Then Beverly said the following sentence: "This year's award goes to Mensah Industrial Supply, under the leadership of its owner and chief executive, Sarah Mensah." The room applauded. Margaret's smile stayed in place for approximately 2 seconds before something behind it shifted. Derek looked at me immediately. I stood, smoothed my dress, and walked toward the stage. Beverly handed me the award and leaned slightly toward the microphone. "We also want to acknowledge that Sarah recently completed what our research committee described as the largest single client contract in the company's history. An extraordinary achievement, in the middle of an extraordinarily difficult year." More applause. Warmer this time. I looked out at the room. 300 people in formal clothes, looking back at me, and at our table, 3 people staring with expressions I could read from 20 feet away. Derek with the careful blankness of someone processing information rapidly, Robert with mild surprise and what appeared to be genuine respect attempting to surface through the surprise, Margaret with the very still face of a woman who had just understood that the floor she was standing on was not where she believed it to be. Michael Holt looked at his hands. I spoke for 4 minutes. I talked about my father and what he had built and why it mattered. I talked about the employees who had made the company worth building. I thanked Patricia and Gerald and the driving staff who treated every delivery like a personal obligation. I said that some businesses are worth more than their balance sheets suggest because of the relationships built inside them over decades, and that protecting those relationships was the only decision I had made since February that I was completely certain about. I did not look at our table while I spoke. When I finished and returned to my seat, the room was still applauding. David Park shook my hand immediately. Beverly was already moving on to introduce the keynote. Calvin Merritt walked to the podium. He was a large man, broad-shouldered even at 63, with the unhurried physical confidence of someone who had spent decades on construction sites rather than conference rooms. He adjusted the microphone and looked across the ballroom for a moment before speaking. He began his keynote with a story. He said he wanted to talk about the kind of business that Atlanta almost lost several times in its history and somehow kept, and he was going to use an example from personal experience. He said that in the spring of 1991, he was a project manager with a hotel renovation contract in downtown Atlanta that was 3 weeks behind schedule because he could not find a plumbing supply distributor willing to meet his delivery timeline on a modified fixture. Order. He called 11 companies. 10 told him the timeline was impossible. The 11th was a small operation run by a man named James Mensah out of a rented storage unit in Decatur, and James told him he would figure it out, then called back 4 hours later with a solution that no established supplier had bothered to look for. Calvin paused. That contract finished on time. His firm went on to use Mensah Industrial exclusively for the next 12 years and referred them to every contractor they knew. He said James Mensah taught him something in 1991 that he had tried to carry through his entire career, that the most valuable people in any industry are the ones who say, "I will figure it out," and mean it. He looked across the room. "I had the pleasure of meeting James's daughter Sarah briefly before dinner tonight," he said, "and I understand she just signed a contract that would have made her father extremely proud." He looked directly at our table. I did not turn to look at the people sitting beside me. I did not need to. The applause that followed lasted long enough that Beverly had to wait at the side of the stage before Calvin stepped away from the podium. When the room settled, Derek leaned toward me quietly. His voice was controlled, but I could hear something underneath it that I had never heard there before. Something that sounded very much like the beginning of understanding. "You're the owner," he said carefully. Not a question exactly. More like a man reading a sentence he didn't expect to find on a page he thought he already knew. I turned toward him calmly. "Have been since December," I said. The dinner continued for another 40 minutes after Calvin Merritt left the stage. Dessert plates arrived. Coffee was poured. Conversations resumed across the room with the easy momentum of people who had eaten well and heard something worth thinking about. The ordinary social machinery of the evening kept moving, as it always does, indifferent to the specific weight settling over one particular table near the east windows. Derek said nothing further to me for the remainder of the night. Margaret spoke twice, both times about things entirely unrelated to the previous 2 hours, the renovation project at their Tuxedo Road home, a friend's daughter's upcoming wedding in Savannah. Her voice carried the particular brightness of someone maintaining composure through sheer force of social conditioning, because women like Margaret Ashworth did not unravel in public. They simply compressed everything difficult into a smaller and smaller space and carried it home with them to deal with in private. Robert shook my hand before leaving the table at the end of the evening. He held it a moment longer than necessary and looked at me with the straightforward respect of a man who had just recalibrated something. "Your father built something remarkable," he said. "He did," I agreed. Robert nodded once, glanced briefly at Derek with an expression I couldn't fully read, then turned and followed his wife toward the lobby. Michael Holt left without speaking to me directly. He said something brief to Derek near the coat check that I didn't hear, and whatever it was caused Derek's jaw to tighten visibly before Michael disappeared into the lobby crowd. I learned later from Richard that Dalton Capital had received formal legal notification that same afternoon, confirming the completed ownership transfer and clarifying that Mensah Industrial Supply was not and had never been available for acquisition discussions by any party acting on the company's behalf. Richard had timed the filing deliberately. He said my father would have appreciated the precision of the moment. Derek drove us home in silence, not the comfortable silence of two people who don't need words, the dense, pressurized silence of a conversation that both people know is coming and neither is ready to begin. The city moved past the car windows in its nighttime state, streetlights and restaurant signs, and the ordinary illuminated evidence of other people's ordinary lives continuing without complication. He pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine and sat without moving. I waited. "How long did you know?" he finally asked. His voice was controlled, but barely. "About Dalton Capital?" I asked. "Since late February." He exhaled slowly through his nose. "And the ownership documents?" "Since January," I said, when my father told me himself. Derek gripped the steering wheel once and then released it. "You let all of this happen. The meetings, the conversations with Mom. You sat through all of it knowing." I looked at the garage door in front of us. "Yes." He turned toward me in the dark. "Why?" I thought about that question for a moment before answering, because I needed to understand what you were actually willing to do, before I made any decisions about what I was willing to accept. The silence that followed was different from the previous one, less pressurized, more resigned. The difference between someone fighting a current and someone finally going still in the water. Derek pressed his fingers against his forehead. "I wasn't trying to steal anything, Sarah. I thought I was helping. I thought the company needed real direction, and you weren't equipped to provide it." I looked at him steadily. "You thought that because your mother told you to think it, and you never once looked at the evidence in front of you to see whether she was right." He opened his mouth briefly and then closed it again. That was the most honest sentence I ever said to Derek Ashworth about our marriage. Not the loudest, not the most emotional, just the truest. And I think somewhere underneath his exhaustion and his embarrassment and whatever calculation was still running quietly in the back of his mind, he understood it was accurate. We sat in that driveway for a long time. Then Derek said quietly, almost to himself more than to me, "I told myself I was protecting you from something you couldn't handle." And there it was. The sentence underneath all the other sentences. Not malice exactly, something almost sadder than malice. A man who had spent his entire life surrounded by his mother's version of the world until her assumptions became his assumptions, until her limitations became his vision, until someone else's ceiling became the roof he built his marriage beneath without ever once questioning the architecture. "I'm going to need you to move out," I said. He nodded very slowly. He didn't argue. He didn't negotiate. He just nodded the way people nod when they already know something is true and have been postponing the moment of saying it aloud. He left the following weekend. He took what was his. He left what was mine. He did not bring Margaret. He carried boxes out to his car with the careful efficiency of a man trying to perform the mechanics of departure without examining the feelings attached to them. At the door, before his final trip to the car, he stopped and looked at me. "I'm sorry," he said. His voice carried the weight of a man who had arrived at sincerity too late to make use of it. "I know," I said. And I meant it. Not as absolution, not as comfort. Simply as acknowledgement that I believed him and that it changed nothing about the decisions that had been made by both of us over the previous 7 years. He walked to his car. He drove away. I stood at the front door and watched the taillights disappear around the corner of the street, and then I went inside and washed the dishes and went to bed. Margaret called me 3 days later. I had expected her to call sooner. The delay told me she had spent 72 hours carefully considering her approach, which was exactly how Margaret Ashworth operated. She spoke for 5 minutes. She talked about Derek's intentions and family loyalty, and the genuine concern she had always felt for the company's long-term health. She used the phrase, "We only wanted what was best for you," twice. She did not apologize directly. Women like Margaret are architecturally incapable of direct apology because direct apology requires acknowledging specific wrongdoing, and Margaret had constructed her entire self-image around the belief that she acted always from appropriate concern rather than personal ambition. I let her finish. Then I said, calmly and without sharpness, "Margaret, I want you to think about something." I paused. "You spent 7 years telling me in every way you could manage that I wasn't capable enough, wasn't serious enough, wasn't the right kind of person for the life your son was building. And every time you said it, I stayed quiet because I thought respect was something I had to earn from you." She was silent. "I don't think that anymore," I said, "and I think that's better for both of us." She said something brief and polite, and we ended the call. She has not contacted me since. Robert sent a handwritten note about 2 weeks later that said simply, "Your father raised you well." I kept it. The divorce was quiet and clean. Richard referred me to a family law attorney in Midtown, a precise, unsentimental woman named Diana, who moved through the process with the efficiency of someone who had seen every variation of marital collapse and treated each one with equal professional respect. There was no dramatic courtroom moment, no contested assets, no performance of injury. Just paperwork and signatures, and the administrative conclusion of a marriage that had been ending longer than either of us acknowledged. By the time everything was finalized in September, I had stopped measuring time by what I had lost and started measuring it by what I was building. The Tennessee contract went live in June. By August, we had added 2 new driver routes to support the expanded volume and hired 3 additional warehouse staff. Patricia promoted her junior accountant to a full accounts manager position and came to me with the proposal herself without being asked, which told me everything I needed to know about how the culture of the company was settling under new management. Gerald pulled me aside one morning in late July beside the loading dock in Decatur. He had a thermos of coffee and the unhurried expression of a man who had been waiting for the right moment to say something. "Your father called me last week," he said. I looked at him. "What did he say?" Gerald smiled slowly. He said he drove past the building on his way to a doctor's appointment. He said the lot was full and the delivery board was filled in completely and the new client signage was up on the front wall. I waited. He said it looked exactly the way he always hoped it would look when he wasn't there anymore. I had to look away briefly toward the parking lot. The sky was pale blue over Memorial Drive, and the summer heat pressed down across the asphalt with its full August weight, and the warehouse behind us hummed with the sound of people doing their work, and I thought about my father driving. Slowly past this building on a Tuesday morning in his reliable old Camry, looking at what 36 years of disciplined work had grown into, and feeling whatever it is that people feel when they realize the thing they built will outlast their direct involvement in it. I visited my father that Saturday. He was sitting on the back porch of his house in East Point, reading The Way He Spent Most of His Recovery, with a glass of water and a ceiling fan turning slowly overhead, and the suburban stillness of a summer afternoon surrounding him. He looked better than he had at any point since February, healthier, more rested. There was a quality to his stillness that had changed from the tired stillness of illness to something closer to the earned quiet of a man who has completed something and set it down without regret. I sat across from him and we talked for almost 2 hours. About the company, about the Tennessee contract and the new hires and what Gerald had said that morning by the loading dock. About the business council dinner and Calvin Merritt. About Richard and Patricia and the shareholders restructuring documents that had been sitting properly filed in Atlanta's public record since December. I told him about Derek, about Margaret, about the kitchen table meeting and Michael Holt and the Dalton Capital conversations that went nowhere because they were never conversations my father's company needed to have. He listened to everything without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, looking at the garden beside the porch where summer flowers were growing in the particular undisciplined way that flowers grow when someone waters them but doesn't manage them too closely. Then he said something I have thought about every day since. "I didn't give you the company because I thought you needed protecting," he said quietly. "I gave it to you because I built it for a reason, and you were the only person who ever understood what that reason was." I looked at him. He continued. "I watched you for 30 years, learning everything I knew and never once asking me to acknowledge it. That's not weakness." He shook his head slowly. "That's exactly the kind of person a company like this needs to survive." I stayed on that porch for another hour after my father went inside to rest. The afternoon light moved across the garden in the slow, unhurried way that summer light moves when there is nowhere urgent to be. I thought about the waiting room at Piedmont Hospital in February, the gray plastic chair, the cold coffee cup, Margaret's voice arriving past me as though I were furniture. I thought about sitting across from Richard Boateng in that quiet coffee shop in Decatur, opening a folder of documents with my name on every controlling line, trying to absorb the reality that my father had seen something in me that I had spent years allowing other people to argue me out of believing. I thought about Derek's face in the car that night, the garage door, the stillness of the driveway. And I thought about something my father told me when I was perhaps 12 years old and had come home from school upset because a teacher had dismissed something I said in class without really hearing it. He had sat down across from me at the kitchen table, the same kitchen table where he had reviewed supplier contracts and employee payroll and 36 years of decisions that built something permanent. He said, "The people who dismiss you are always working from incomplete information. Your job is not to convince them. Your job is to know what you're worth long enough for the truth to become visible on its own." I was 37 years old before I fully understood what he meant, but I understood it now. There is a version of this story where everything ends with a dramatic confrontation, where Margaret sits across a table and faces a precise accounting of every dismissal she delivered over 7 years, where Derek watches from a distance while Atlanta's business community acknowledges what he was never willing to see, where Michael Holt calls to acknowledge that Dalton Capital misjudged the situation entirely. Some of those things happened. Some of them didn't. What I know is this. The company my father built in 1987 with $4,000 and a used delivery van employs 46 people today. It has contracts across 6 southeastern states. It has a scholarship fund for employees' children that Patricia proposed and I approved and my father cried about quietly when I told him. It has a loading dock supervisor named Curtis, who greeted me by my first name for the first time in September and meant it the way people mean things when they finally believe them. And it has an owner who arrived at her own strength later than she should have, through a longer and more difficult route than was necessary, because she spent too many years measuring herself through the eyes of people who were never looking clearly to begin with. I don't carry bitterness about that. Bitterness is expensive, and I have better things to do with the energy. What I carry instead is the particular quiet confidence of someone who understands exactly what they built and exactly why it matters. That is the thing nobody can take from you once you fully own it. Not a marriage ending. Not a boardroom dismissal. Not 7 years of being told you weren't the right kind of person for the room you were already standing in. My father taught me that the most important work is always the work other people don't see coming. I finally understand what he meant by that too.